Welcome to the debate. Imagine you are walking into a theater to watch a classic film, right? One you've seen 100 times.
Yeah, an absolute classic.
Exactly. But as the movie plays out, you discover that the ultimate villain of the story, the character you have despised for your entire life, was actually written in the original script as the tragic, sacrificial hero.
Wow. I mean, that sounds completely impossible.
Right? It sounds absurd, but, well, what if that exact kind of monumental misread happened not with the movie, but with the oldest, most foundational text in human history? What if centuries of inherited tradition have sort of painted over the actual grammar of the text, creating a cosmic villain where there simply wasn't one?
That is a massive claim to start with.
It is, but that is exactly what we are examining today. We're looking at what might be the most consequential misreading in biblical literature. Our central question is this: is the serpent, the Nahash, in Genesis 3 the origin of cosmic evil and the embodiment of Satan? Or is it actually the first Christological archetype of wisdom and substitutionary redemption?
And, it is a question that completely upends how most people understand the entire narrative arc of the material. I mean, if you change the identity of the serpent in the garden, you fundamentally alter the origin story of human rebellion.
Exactly. And this debate emerges directly from Zachary David Enfield's structural and philological analysis of the biblical texts. His work looks past the medieval folklore we're also used to, and it forces us back into the rigid grammar of the ancient Hebrew.
Right. It challenges the inherited tradition regarding the serpent, the dragon, and really the very nature of the adversarial role itself.
Spot on. So I will be representing the position that the Nahash is a symbol of divine wisdom, assigned a substitutionary redemptive role. It is a direct prefiguration of Christ, and it is completely distinct from Satan.
And I will be representing the classical position, the view that the serpent is the primeval instigator of humanity's rupture with God. It is inextricably linked to the adversarial role, it's the catalyst for the fall of humanity, and, well, it is later canonically identified as the devil.
So let me lay out the structural foundation of my position here. And I want to be very clear. I'm going to stand my ground firmly on this from the absolute start. There is no reason to allow the premise that Satan is in this text. Reading Satan into Genesis 3 is an untextual importation of later tradition.
Untextual. I mean, that's a strong word.
It is, but it's accurate. If we look strictly at the Hebrew text of Genesis, it never calls the Nahash evil. It never calls it satanic. It never even calls it a liar. The creature is introduced with the Hebrew word arum, which translates to wise, perceptive, or discerning.
Sure, but...
And wait, let me just add, it is the exact same root word used positively throughout the book of Proverbs to describe the prudence of a wise person. The text actually places the serpent in a sacrificial role.
A sacrificial role? By cursing it?
Yes, exactly. When God says it is cursed above all livestock, he is elevating it to the highest redemptive sacrificial position. That is exactly why God later commands Moses to forge a bronze serpent and lift it up for national healing in Numbers 21. And, it is why Jesus explicitly identifies his own crucifixion with that lifted serpent in John 3:14. The grammar strictly demands that we view the Nahash as a redemptive archetype, not a cosmic villain.
Okay, I hear the linguistic focus on the word arum, but my perspective rests on the undeniable narrative trajectory of the text itself. The serpent is the catalyst for the fall.
Yeah.
It introduces a lethal subversion of God's direct command. When you look at the language of the judgment in Genesis 3, where God says, "On your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life," that is universally understood as clear evidence of divine judgment and humiliation.
Is it, though?
Yeah, it's certainly not an elevation. Furthermore, we can't just read these texts as isolated, disconnected documents. We rely on canonical harmony. Revelation 12:9 explicitly identifies that ancient serpent as the devil and Satan. The New Testament pulls back the curtain on the Genesis creature's true adversarial nature.
All right, let's get right into the mechanics of that subversion you just mentioned. Because I think this is where the classical view really starts to force a narrative onto the text. You argue the serpent subverted God's command. Walk me through how exactly you see that playing out in the dialogue between the serpent and Eve.
Well, I come at it from a pretty straightforward reading of the garden interaction, and honestly, I just don't buy the idea that the serpent is this innocent wisdom figure. The serpent deliberately manipulates Eve.
How so?
God gave a very clear command to Adam, "Do not eat of the tree or you will die." The serpent approaches Eve and directly contradicts the Creator, saying verbatim, "You will not surely die." It introduces deception into the human story. It paints God as a tyrant who is withholding knowledge, claiming, God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened. This is manipulation 101. It takes a truth that their eyes would be opened and weaponizes it to foster human rebellion.
Okay, I have to stop you there. I am going to call out this move entirely because I am not convinced by that line of reasoning, and I am not going to yield any ground here.
Why not? The text is right there.
Because the claim that the Nahash introduced deception is factually incorrect according to the internal logic of the text itself. Let's look at 1 Timothy 2:14. It says explicitly that Eve was deceived, but it never says the Nahash deceived her.
Wait, if she was deceived and she's talking to the serpent,
Who actually alters God's command? That's the question we have to ask. God told Adam, "You shall not eat of it." But when Eve speaks to the Nahash, she says, "God has said, you shall not eat it, nor shall you touch it, lest you die." Eve added the prohibition about touching it herself.
that's a fair observation about Eve adding to the command, sure, but the serpent still leverages that interaction to outright contradict the penalty of death. It literally says, "You will not surely die."
Right. But the Nahash engaged the command exactly as Eve had already modified it. And when the Nahash says, "You will not surely die," we have to ask a very practical, literal question. Did they die physically that day?
Well, no. I mean, they were exiled, but they didn't drop dead on the spot.
Exactly. Adam lived to be 930 years old. So the Nahash spoke what Enfield identifies as substitutionary truth. Humanity did not die physically that day because the death was to be carried by another.
That's quite a theological leap.
It's the mechanics of wisdom. The Nahash introduces the complexity of wisdom, the reality that a consequence can be transferred. If you track every single statement the Nahash made, every single one was confirmed by the text. It said their eyes would be opened. Genesis 3:7 confirms they were. It said they would know good and evil. Genesis 3:22 has God himself confirming that statement.
Right.
Where is the lie? A deception came from within humanity's own addition to the word, not from the Nahash. You are attributing humanity's failure to a cosmic scapegoat, and there's no textual reason to allow that premise.
Okay, but even if you argue that the serpent's words possess some sort of technical, paradoxical truth regarding the delay of their physical death, you cannot ignore the verdict handed down by God immediately afterward. You claim the serpent is an elevated Christological archetype, but the decree is to eat dust and be cursed.
Yes, the curse. Let's look at it.
Throughout the ancient Near East, crawling on the belly and eating dust is the ultimate scriptural symbol of defeat, subjugation, and humiliation. Conquered kings lick the dust of their enemies. It is utterly unfit for a Christological archetype to be placed in the posture of eternal degradation.
See, I am going to call out your translation of the Hebrew grammar right there. You are allowing modern English connotations of the word curse to completely override the syntax of the Hebrew sentence.
How so? A curse is a curse.
Not in this structural context. When God speaks to the Nahash, he says, "Arar ata mikol habehema." The word mikol is a compound. It means more than or from above. God does not say cursed beneath all livestock. He says cursed above all livestock.
Wait, how does being cursed above something turn into an elevation? That doesn't make sense.
Because a curse, in this ancient structural context, is a vocational assignment of burden. Think of it like a lightning rod on a house.
Okay.
They are the sacrificial animals of the temple. The Nahash is being elevated above the sacrificial livestock to the highest redemptive substitutionary role.
That is a fascinating way to read, Mikol, I'll give you that. But you still have to deal with the eating dust part of the decree. how do you elevate a creature while simultaneously commanding it to eat dirt?
Well, you have to ask what dust actually represents in the context of Genesis. In Genesis 2:7, humanity is formed from the dust. In Genesis 3:19, God says to humanity, "Dust you are, and to dust you shall return."
Right, mortality.
Yes. Dust equals human mortality. It is the fragility of the human condition. To eat dust is not some zoological punishment about a snake's diet. It is a theological vocation. To eat the dust is to consume, to carry, to bear human mortality.
Bear mortality?
That Nahash is assigned to bear the fatal consequence of human failure. And I want to challenge you directly on the canonical implications of your classical view here.
Go ahead.
If the serpent is purely satanic, inherently evil, and condemned to degradation, why does God command Moses to forge a bronze serpent for national healing in Numbers 21? When the Israelites are dying in the wilderness, God doesn't say, make a bronze lamb. He says, make a serpent, lift it up on a pole, and whoever looks at it will live. Why would God use a demonic condemned symbol as the instrument of salvation?
That is a highly compelling point, and, Numbers 21 has always been a complex passage. But I would argue that the bronze serpent simply represents the judgment of the affliction itself.
The judgment of the affliction?
Yeah, the people were being bitten by fiery serpents. Looking at the bronze serpent was looking at their sin, judged and rendered powerless on a pole. But regardless of how we parse the mechanics of Numbers 21, you know as well as I do that the New Testament is the ultimate interpreter of the Old Testament.
Here we go.
And the New Testament does not leave the identity of the Edenic serpent ambiguous at all. Revelation 12:9 or Revelation 20.2 explicitly link that ancient serpent to the devil and Satan. John the Revelator seals its identity as the ultimate enemy of God. You simply cannot decouple the Genesis creature from the devil when the final book of the canon explicitly fuses them together.
I have to call out a massive structural flaw in that argument, and it is a move that classical theology relies on far too heavily. You are committing a vocabulary collapse, and I'm not going to let that slide.
A vocabulary collapse?
Yes. The Hebrew Bible rigorously refuses to make that collapse, and we shouldn't either. You are taking apocalyptic Greek from the end of the 1st century and using it to erase the precise lexical distinctions of ancient Hebrew.
Hold on a second. How is citing the plain text of Revelation a vocabulary collapse? John literally says, the ancient serpent.
Because the Hebrew Bible maintains a strict, unyielding distinction between two completely different words, Nahash and Tannin. They are not synonyms. Nahash is the word used in Eden, and it's the word used in Numbers 21. It operates in the registers of wisdom, consequence, and healing.
Okay.
Think of the Nahash like a scalpel precise, probing, and capable of both wounding and healing. Tannin, on the other hand, is the word for a dragon or a sea monster. It is used in Exodus 7 when Moses stands before Pharaoh and in Ezekiel 29 to describe the king of Egypt.
So Tannin is more about power?
Exactly. Tannin operates in the register of empire, coercive power, and concentrated political domination. It is a broadsword. When Moses is out in the wilderness learning wisdom at the burning bush, his staff turns into a Nahash. But when he goes into the court of Pharaoh to confront the full weight of imperial sovereignty, his staff doesn't become a Nahash. It becomes a Tannin. The vocabulary escalates to match the threat.
Okay, I follow the distinction in the Old Testament, the scalpel and the broadsword, but how does that negate Revelation 12?
Because the Greek word drakon, dragon, in Revelation is the translation of Tannin, not Nahash. Revelation's dragon is a critique of coercive state power. It is specifically targeting the Roman Empire, a system that devours and dominates its subjects. It is not talking about the Nahash of Eden.
That's a very specific mapping.
It is, and it's structurally required. You cannot anachronistically project Revelation's apocalyptic critique of the Roman Empire backward to erase Genesis's distinct grammar of wisdom. The Nahash prefigures Christ as the substitutionary bearer of mortality. The Tannin judges Rome as the coercive beast. They are completely different archetypes.
But if you separate them entirely,
If you collapse them, you create a theological nightmare for John 3:14. When Jesus says, "Just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up," he is identifying himself with the Nahash. If the Nahash is Satan, Jesus is identifying himself with the devil. That is grammatically and theologically impossible. I am not yielding ground on that.
I come at this entirely differently. You were separating the serpent from the adversary based on this rigid categorization of vocabulary, but the adversarial role is woven into the very fabric of the Genesis 3 narrative itself. It isn't just about the words, it's about the action.
The action?
Yes! Look at Genesis 3:15. It is widely known as the Proto-Evangelium, the first gospel. God says to the serpent, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel."
Ah, yes. Genesis 3:15.
historically, Orthodox tradition has universally read this as the promise of Christ, the woman's seed, crushing the head of Satan, the serpent. This proves the serpent is the ultimate enemy, destined for destruction. I mean, if the serpent is a Christological archetype, as you claim, then who exactly is getting their head crushed?
I totally see why the tradition leans on that reading. I mean, it feels incredibly satisfying to have the hero crush the villain's head, right? But I am not going to give you that ground because the traditional reading of Genesis 3:15 completely defies logic if you actually map out the terms based on the Hebrew grammar.
How does it defy logic?
Well, you say the serpent is Satan. Let's plug that into the text. If the serpent is Satan, then look at what God is actually saying. God says, "I will put enmity between you and the woman." If you equals Satan, God is literally saying, "I will put Satan between Satan and the woman."
Wait, no. That relies on translating the word enmity identically to the word Satan, which feels like a massive leap. It's not a leap at all. It's the literal linguistic definition of the terms. The Hebrew word used for enmity is aiva, which means opposition or an adversarial tension. In the Hebrew Bible, Satan is not a proper name with a capital S. It is a functional role meaning the adversary. Okay, functionally yes. So the enmity is the adversarial condition. The rupture between humanity and mortality is the satanic role. God places the adversarial condition between the Nahash and the woman. Neither of them is Satan. The condition between them is. All right. So if the serpent isn't Satan and the woman's seed isn't Jesus crushing an evil entity, how on earth do you map the head and the heel? You have a crushing happening. Who is doing what to whom?
This is where Enfield outlines the true structural reading, and it completely inverts the classical model. The woman's seed is humanity as a collective. The heel is the fragile foundation of human dominion.
The heel is humanity?
Yes. We see this metaphor perfectly illustrated in the book of Daniel, chapter 2. Nebuchadnezzar dreams of a great statue representing human empires, a head of gold, a chest of silver, but it stands on feet of iron mixed with clay. It is a fragile, easily broken foundation. Humanity is the heel.
And the serpent seed?
The Nahash's seed is the Christological line. So what happens? Humanity, the woman's seed, bruises the head of the Nahash Messiah. We see this vividly in Isaiah 53, where the suffering servant is bruised and crushed for our iniquities. That happens historically at the crucifixion. Humanity crushes Christ.
Walk me through that again slowly. You are arguing that humanity crushes Christ's head rather than Christ crushing Satan's head. That is a staggering reorientation of 2,000 years of theology.
Yes, it is, because Christ is the crushed one. He bears the violence of humanity. And in return, Christ, the Nahash Messiah, strikes humanity's heel. He destabilizes the false foundations of human empire, human power, and self-rule.
Destabilizes the heel.
Right. Think back to that statue in Daniel 2. A stone cut without hands strikes the feet of the statue, the heel, and the whole edifice of human empire crumbles. It's a complete inversion of the traditional reading, but it is the only reading that honors the strict Hebrew grammar. It avoids making God place Satan inside Satan, and it perfectly aligns with the sacrificial mechanics of the cross.
Yeah.
Jesus didn't carry his own cross. He carried ours. Humanity bruised his head, and his substitutionary death shatters the fragile foundation of our worldly dominion.
That is undeniably profound. But, I have to say it requires dismantling a massive amount of inherited theology. You are asking listeners to accept that the early church, the patristic writers, and millennia of theologians simply missed the fundamental architecture of the fall.
Well, texts get obscured over time.
True. But while your reading of McCall as above and your meticulous distinction between the Tannin broadsword and the Nahash scalpel are linguistically fascinating, the traditional view has endured for a reason. The overarching narrative trajectory of the text makes sense of it.
Does it?
Yes, the introduction of enmity, the deceitful framing of God's command regarding the fruit, and the canonical tradition all present a highly compelling case that the serpent represents the inception of the adversarial force in human history. To strip the serpent of its adversarial nature is to risk unmooring the biblical explanation for the origin of human rebellion. We lose the origin of the enemy.
But that is exactly the paradigm-shifting point Enfield's work makes. Human rebellion originated in humanity. We don't need a cosmic villain to explain human failure.
So we are the villain.
Exactly. Eve added to the command of her own volition. Adam stood right there with her in silence and ate. The text places the responsibility for the fall squarely on human shoulders. So to summarize my position, strict adherence to Hebrew grammar, the vital distinction between Nahash and Tannan, and Jesus' own explicit words in John 3:14 structurally demand that we view the serpent as a primordial archetype of wisdom.
A lightning rod.
Yes, it is a symbol of substitutionary bearing, a lightning rod taking the strike of human mortality. It is not the devil. When we have the courage to clear away the medieval folklore, what we see is the atonement written into the very beginning of the text.
And to summarize mine, while the linguistic mechanics you present are intricate and demand serious consideration, the broader canonical witness, especially the New Testament's apocalyptic identification of the ancient serpent with the devil, provides a theological through line that defines the creature as the inception of the adversarial force.
Right.
That said, I think we both find ourselves looking at the exact same profound realization from two different angles. Whether one views the serpent as an archetype of Christological substitution or as the origin of the adversarial condition, we absolutely agree that the events in Genesis 3 fundamentally restructure the human condition.
We do. Absolutely.
They define the nature of mortality, the desperate necessity of redemption, and the shape of the biblical narrative moving forward.
We completely agree on that. And I think there is a profound value in doing exactly what we've done today, which is testing centuries of inherited tradition against the rigid, uncompromising constraints of original language and structural logic. There is so much more to explore within this source material regarding how these ancient typologies shape our understanding of power, empire, and salvation.
It really forces us to ask a difficult question. Are we reading the text itself, or are we just reading the history of how the text has been read?
Precisely. We aren't here to declare a definitive winner today. We leave it to you, the listener, to weigh the evidence, the grammar, and the constraints for yourselves. But I hope this conversation has shown that when you look past the fairy tale and read the text with the precision of a binding legal document, the familiar story reveals a depth that is truly staggering. You open the text expecting to find a villain, and instead you might just find the very first shadow of the cross. Thank you for listening to The Debate.